British left British Mandate Palestine, the United Nations General Assembly in November 1947 adopted a resolution to partition the Mandate territory between a Jewish state, Israel, and an Arab state, Palestine. The Arab states refused to accept the existence of a state for the Arab people in only part of the former British Mandate territory, wanting the whole territory, and attacked Israeli forces. The reason for the Arab invasion was singular. The objection to Israel was that Israel was Jewish. If Israel had been Arab, the invasion would not have occurred. Anti-Zionism, from the get-go, was anti-Semitic. Israel repelled the invading forces and was admitted into the UN in May 1949. In these early days, the UN behaved properly, and the authoritarian states, though they did not agree with what the UN was doing, were not able to manipulate the UN to endorse their disagreement. Anti-Zionists, from the very beginning, in addition to attacking Israel directly, victimized Arabs who had lived in the former British Mandate territory or were still living there, in the West Bank and Gaza, as a strategy for ending the existence of the State of Israel. Part of that strategy involved UNWRA, the United Nations Relief and Works Association. UNWRA was nominally there for the provision of relief and public works for anyone who'd been living in the former Mandate territory between June 1st, 46 and May 15th, 1948, and who had left their residence and work because of the 1948 conflict. The benefits of UNWRA extended to the descendants of the initial eligible beneficiaries. UNWRA functionally had a more sinister role, to counter resettlement or local integration of its target population, to keep those under its umbrella as depending on UNWRA and surrounding Israel, to avoid durable solutions to the problems generated for this population by the 1948 conflict. The UNWRA clientele was instrumentalized by anti-Zionists to support a claim of right of return. The result of the enforced dependency on UNWRA, coupled with a claim of right of return, would have been and would still be, if realized, the overwhelming of Israel demographically to turn a Jewish state into an Arab state. The public nature of UNWRA increased over the years. Anti-Zionists stored ammunition in schools operated by UNWRA. They smuggled arms and terrorists in UNWRA ambulances. They used UNWRA social clubs to host terrorist meetings. The schools financed by UNWRA have been anti-Zionist indoctrination units. The textbooks paid for by UNWRA are anti-Zionist propaganda pulp. UNWRA turned a blind eye to theft of medicine for sale on the black market. UNWRA had Hamas members on its payroll. UNWRA was so permeated with Hamas members that several UNWRA staff members participated in the October 7th attacks in Israel. UNWRA initially was a case apart, a hostile component of the UN in a UN environment that was not otherwise hostile. The situation changed dramatically in 1967 when Israel managed to thwart a second Arab invasion. The result of the second attack and its response was that Israel obtained control over Gaza and the West Bank, previously under the control of Egypt and Jordan. This shift in control triggered a shift in anti-Zionist strategies. Although the Arab states attempted one more invasion in 1973, which also failed, anti-Zionists accelerated partially after the 1967 war and completely after the 1973 war their reliance on the strategy of victimizing the Arab population under the mandate of UNWRA and other Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza as a vehicle for destroying Israel. Part of that strategy was the combination of terrorism and delegitimization. Terrorists attacked, Israel defended and responded. Anti-Zionists decontextualized the defenses and responses from the terrorist attacks which precipitated them and characterized these defenses and responses as gratuitous human rights violations. With the delegitimization strategy, the UN as a whole became the focus of anti-Zionist efforts. Every attempt was made through every component of the UN to turn the UN against Israel. This delegitimization strategy, in tandem with an authoritarian majority in the United Nations General Assembly, including at the time the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain countries, led the UN General Assembly led to the UN General Assembly resolution in 1975, equating Zionism with racism. The resolution was repealed in 1991 after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Iron Curtain countries after the Iron Curtain had been drawn back. All the former Soviet Union states and all the former Iron Curtain states voted in favor of the repeal. The United Nations Human Rights Commission, one of the original UN organs, became a primary anti-Zionist strategic target. Initially, the UN Human Rights Commission focused on themes to the exclusion of countries. Once the system shifted to countries, it shifted to Israel almost immediately. The first target of the Human Rights Commission was South Africa in 1967. Second was Israel in 1969. For 6 years, the Commission considered only these two countries and no others. Even after the Commission broadened its scope to other countries, the time spent on Israel was disproportionate. For the next 30 years, from 1976 to 2006, almost 30% of country-specific resolutions and 50% of the 15% of the time were directed against Israel. The Commission had two agenda items dealing with country human rights violations, one for Israel and another for the rest of the world. The invective against Israel in speeches and resolutions by far exceeded the language used against other countries, with real human rights violations that justified international attention. The Commission was replaced in April 2006 by a new Human Rights Council. The UN General Assembly, in a resolution creating the Council, recognized, and I quote, the importance of ensuring universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization. The phrase sets out the reason why the Commission was abolished, its double standards and politicization. Objectively, the phrase is in reference to Israel, the state which was by far the greatest victim of the lack of universality and objectivity, the most obvious target of selectivity and double standards. The victim of politicization was plainly Israel. Yet Israel is a tiny country, and the Jewish people, for whom the existence of the state of Israel is the expression of the right to self-determination, is a tiny population. Out of a global population of then more than 6.6 billion people, the Jewish population worldwide in 2006 did not even reach 13 million, a mere 0.02%. The Commission's ganging up on such a small country was not itself enough to justify the ending of a primary organ of the UN. The problem was the way the ganging up was done. Hostility towards the existence of Israel generated with the UN a devil's bargain. There are 56 states in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. OIC states are not randomly distributed throughout the planet. There's a concentration of these states within the Asian and African UN blocs, which together formed a majority of the UN Human Rights Commission. Not every OIC state is anti-Zionist, but the OIC defers to anti-Zionists. Standing up for the right to self-determination of the Jewish people is not a priority for any OIC state. Human rights violator states came to realize that they could avoid accountability by promising the OIC to vote against Israel in exchange for the OIC's support for diverting Commission attention away from their own violations. Anti-Zionism became the weapon of choice for real violators to shield themselves against criticism. Every minute in the Human Rights Commission spent on Israel was a minute not spent on human rights violations which justified international concern. In the later years of the Commission, anti-Zionism prolonged the suffering of victims of human rights violations everywhere. Anti-Zionism facilitated entry of human rights violator states into the Commission, and they're joining the chorus of mischief makers once they got there. The problem then was not Israel, it was the Commission. The Commission had become an abusers' caucus. Because the Human Rights Commission had degenerated into an anti-Zionist commission, the global human rights community, both states and non-governmental organizations, concluded that the commission had to be replaced. Human rights violators were happy to agree, but for different reasons. when gross violators saw the Commission being criticized for double standards and politicization, they did not think of Israel, rather, they thought of themselves. Gross violators reflexively reject criticism and claim that they're being unfairly criticized. They portrayed the Commission as the Western world ganging up on the developing world. Gross violators embraced the stated objective of the new Council, the elimination of double standards and politicization, as elimination of criticism of them. It was easy to destroy the Human Rights Commission because it managed to please almost no one. Violators thought it was doing too much. Human rights promoters thought it was doing too little. Finding a better replacement was a lot more difficult. Human rights respecting states made a valiant effort to avoid, with the replacement UN Human Rights Council, the faults of the Commission, but their efforts mostly failed. Even in the old Commission, the Asian and African blocs had a razor-thin majority, 27 out of 53, majority of 1. With the new Council, the majority became more pronounced, 26 out of 47, or a majority of 2. From Commission to Council, the rules for calling special sessions changed. For the Commission, the threshold was a majority of states. For the Council, the threshold was 1/3. The frequency of sittings also changed. The Commission used to sit once a year in general session. The Council had to hold no fewer than 3 sessions a year. The UN General Assembly introduced for the Council a universal periodic review. Under that review, the human rights record of every country became periodically subject to review by the Council. A smaller membership, a shift in the geographic balance away from the West and towards the OIC states, a lower threshold for calling special sessions, and more frequent sessions all contributed to the Council's unrelenting, institutionalized, and near single-minded focus on Israel. One can see the logic of these reforms in a council controlled by human rights promoters. For instance, a low threshold vote for special sessions in a council controlled by rights-respecting states would allow for ready intervention in emerging human rights crises. A human rights council, which meets frequently throughout the year, has, if one ignores reality, the same naive justification that the council could more easily and quickly respond to new human rights violations. It should have been obvious that a council or a commission before it determined to gang up on Israel in exchange for immunity to violators whose violations justified international concern would, with a lower voting threshold, call one special session after another to condemn Israel. It should have been obvious that more frequent sessions of an anti-Israel body would mean more anti-Israel resolutions. It should have been obvious that a body with fewer members and a greater number of states from the Asian and African bloc would be all too easily dominated by the anti-Israel agenda of the OIC states. The United Nations Human Rights Council, since its inception in 2006, has had 36 special sessions. The first 3 focused on Israel. Altogether, there have been 11 such sessions with an Israeli focus out of 36. There have been no special sessions on China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, 1 in Russia, and 1 in Iran. Resolutions against Israel proliferated every UN Human Rights Council session. At the session from February to April this year, which I attended in part as a member of B'NAPR's international delegation, there were 4 resolutions on Israel, none on China, Venezuela, or Zimbabwe, and 1 on Russia and Iran each. The language used against Israel in these resolutions was vituperative, far stronger than that used in other country-specific resolutions. Israel in the Council is the only country with a special rapporteur who has a mandate without an end date limit. Only one country, Israel, has a Human Rights Council dedicated agenda item. When the UN Human Rights Council began, its resolutions and special sessions focused on Israel alone. If one looks at the world from the perspective only of the UN Human Rights Council, Israel has gone from being the only human rights violator to the worst human rights violator. Of course, this perspective is completely divorced from reality. The Universal Periodic Review, which I mentioned, turned out not to be as universal as the name suggested because authoritarian states were able to game the system. For each country's universal periodic review session, 3.5 hours or 210 minutes is allocated. 70 minutes of those 210 is allocated to the states subject to review. The sessions are interactive dialogues. Each state subject to review gets to speak during the review at the beginning, the middle, and the end. The member states of the council can speak for a maximum of 3 minutes. Observer states can speak for a maximum of 2 minutes. If the number of states representative who want to speak is too large for the time allocated for the review, the time for the review is divided among the country representatives who wish to speak. The turn of China came up at the Human Rights Council in Geneva in January 2024, and I was there also for that session. Because of the large number of country representatives who wanted to make a statement in 2024 in China, 163, the time allocated to each country to speak was 45 seconds. Many of the countries that spoke at the review in 2024 had nothing but good things to say about the human rights record of China. Reuters, the news agency, reported that China lobbied non-Western countries to speak at the 2024 review and in those speeches to praise its human rights record. A Chinese diplomatic note sent to these countries read, and I quote, "I would kindly request your delegation to render valuable support to China and make constructive recommendations in the interactive dialogue, taking into account the friendly relations and cooperation between our two countries." The diplomatic note included specific speaking points to raise. The Chinese lobbying was successful. China generated a filibuster, enlisting governments over which it had influence to chew up the time allocated to the review and limit the time available for those countries who wanted to address the human rights record of China honestly. The result was that in that review, most of the interlocutors were uncritical of China and followed a standard format. One state representative after another welcomed the Chinese delegation and their report to the Council on their human rights record. These delegations commended or hailed or supported or saluted or applauded or congratulated or expressed appreciation for or recognized the remarkable achievements or acknowledged the impressive progress or significant gains of China in its human rights record. The delegations then recommended that China continue doing what it had been doing. The delegations concluded by wishing China success in the review. Even in this litany of obsequiousness, there were a few statements which stood out. Venezuela encouraged China to continue its repression in Tibet and Xinjiang in a euphemistic sort of way. Both Venezuela and Hungary attacked the use of the Universal Periodic Review for its human rights criticism of China, the little bit that there was. Hungary urged the Universal Periodic Review not to be used as a platform for instrumentalization of human rights issues. Tanzania at least was honest about what was happening, commending China for providing development assistance to developing countries. Now, to examine every UN organ would more than exhaust my time and your patience, but I'll mention only one other, the International Court of Justice. Israel is a state party to the Genocide Convention. The convention provides that disputes between state parties about the fulfillment of the convention could be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. South Africa, also state party, asked the International Court of Justice to find Israel in violation of the Genocide Convention by reason of its response to the Hamas October 7th attack. The court in January this year decided that there is a risk of genocide and set a risk of genocide in Gaza and set out provisional measures Israel should follow to prevent genocide. And the Zionists misinterpreted the court judgment like more or less everything else related to Israel as a finding that Israel, at least plausibly or provisionally, had been committing genocide, yet there was no such finding. However, even the finding of a risk of genocide, a risk which the court did find, was mistaken. The court finding was based on statements by Israeli officials which were critical of Hamas, and the court misread these statements as if they were referring to all Palestinians. Another UN body did the same, the Expert Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, established under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, issued a statement in October last year with the same misreading about a statement from the Israeli Defense Minister. Now, to equate all Palestinians with Hamas is a form of racism. For the International Court of Justice and the Expert Racism Committee to accuse Israeli leaders of doing that when they were not is a more contemporary reflection of the already repealed accusation that Zionism is racism. The International Court of Justice determination was problematic from another perspective, the manner in which the judges are chosen. The judges of the International Court of Justice are chosen to 9-year renewable terms by the UN General Assembly. As one might expect, the General Assembly is as politically skewed as the United Nations Human Rights Council. In its most recent regular session last fall, there were 5 resolutions on Israel, but none on China, Venezuela, Afghanistan, or Zimbabwe, and 1 on Iran and Russia each. The fact that the continuation in office of the judges of the court depends on a body which is hostile to Israel created a reasonable apprehension that the judges in the South African case were biased. Now, I also want to say a bit about the International Criminal Court, partly because it is relevant to what I said about the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court had issued an arrest warrant against Sudanese former President Omar al-Bashir because there were reasonable grounds to believe that he was criminally responsible for genocide in Darfur. The court had jurisdiction over the atrocities in Darfur as a result of a UN Security Council referral. South Africa is a state party to the court statute. The court asked South Africa to arrest al-Bashir while he was visiting South Africa in 2015. South Africa declined to do so. A pre-trial chamber of the court in 2017 found that South Africa had breached its obligations under the court treaty by this failure to arrest. In principle, the International Court of Justice should have dismissed the South African application against Israel because South Africa did not come to the court with clean hands, providing in effect a safe haven for an accused genocide killer. That issue was before the court. The Neighbors International had filed an intervener brief at the court, a brief to which I contributed, which made this very point. Yet the court in its provisional judgment made no reference to this issue. The International Criminal Court itself, its prosecutor in May this year, asked the court to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, Gallant, the Minister of Defense, at the same time as the court asked the court to issue arrest warrants against Yahya Sinwar, head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Mohammed Diab Ibrahim, Commander-in-Chief of the Al-Qassam Brigades, and Ismail Haniyeh, head of Hamas, the Hamas Political Bureau. These requests opposed a false symmetry between Hamas perpetrators and Israeli responders. The International Criminal Court is treaty-based, not UN-based. The court in principle should not pose the same problem as the United Nations, since Israel is not a state party to the court treaty and consequently should not be subject to the jurisdiction of the court. Yet the court, ignoring the law and its own treaty, decided it did have jurisdiction. The basis for that decision on jurisdiction was that the Palestinian Authority, in the name of Palestine, had signed the court treaty. With that court decision on jurisdiction, a crime in the territory of Palestine or against Palestinians arguably fell within the jurisdiction of the court. Now, there is a treaty that deals with this issue, the Montevideo Convention on Rights and Duties of States, which sets out 4 criteria for statehood: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and a capacity to enter relations with other states. These criteria are today considered customary international law. The Palestinian Authority meets none of these prerequisites for statehood. A pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court in February 2022 ruled that the Palestinian Authority had the legal capacity to sign the court treaty. The court based that decision on the vote of the United Nations General Assembly, which gave Palestine non-member state observer status. In other words, the court case preferred politics over law, a vote of the General Assembly over a treaty and customary international law. The decision may have given anti-Zionists some cheer, but from the perspective of the value of the court as an institution, the judgment was harmful. A court which prefers politics over law is not really a court. So the UN today, as well as the International Criminal Court, are tainted by the global expansion of authoritarian rule. Can the problem be fixed? The shift from Commission to Council is instructive. It's easy to think of ways in which the UN can be reformed. Realizing those reforms is difficult to impossible. There are just too many human rights violating states for the UN to be an effective mechanism for advocacy of respect for human rights. Before engaging in or even advocating reform, we have to address the question whether the UN is reformable. The experience of the movement from UN Human Rights Commission to Council show that as long as the membership of the UN remains the same from the old to the new, it is not reformable. Although this presentation is focused mostly on Israel, one can focus on other countries and come to the same conclusions. China, who I mentioned before briefly, is the flip side of the coin. China, despite its unending sequence of mass atrocities and gross and flagrant human rights violations, is at the UN practically ignored. And the reason is the same, the overwhelming influence of authoritarian states on the UN. Should the democratic states just give up on the UN as a lost cause? In answering that question, it's worth looking at the International Holocaust Remembrance Lines, not because of its focus on Holocaust remembrance, but because of its membership restrictions. The alliance, or UNWRA, will accept full membership for only those countries, now I'm reading from their rules, countries commonly seen as democracies, not countries with authoritarian, dictatorial, or totalitarian regimes. So it's no coincidence that the definition of anti-Semitism that UNWRA has adopted is widely accepted in democracies, but uniformly rejected by anti-Zionists and not embraced by the UN. One can see the problem in the recent report of the academic freedom report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education for Rita Shaheed. It was last April, and this is what she wrote, and I'm quoting. It's reported, for example, that about 120 universities in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland have adopted the UNWRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism to silence lawful speech, support of Palestinian human rights, and the right to self-determination. University staff and students have been subjected to unreasonable investigations and disciplinary proceedings based on this redefinition and harmed by false allegations of anti-Semitism. That's what she wrote. Yet the UNWRA definition of anti-Semitism does not conflate criticisms of Israel with anti-Semitism. In fact, it states the exact opposite, stating that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Nor is the UNWRA definition of anti-Semitism a redefinition. It does not replace an earlier definition of anti-Semitism. The UNWRA definition also does not oppose Palestinian human rights or self-determination. The claims of this rapporteur of unreasonable investigations and disciplinary proceedings and false allegations are unsubstantiated. The claims are coupled with so much that is demonstrably false that the claims themselves have to be questioned. So the question becomes, what is the value of the UN today, given the global expansion of authoritarian rule? I would say there are a few. One is that there are some components of the UN relatively untouched by the global expansion of authoritarian rule. One such component is the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. One explanation for that apoliticism is that it is a treaty-based body flowing from the Refugee Convention, and non-democratic states tend not to sign on to the convention. Another reason is that the statute of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees provides that the competence of the High Commissioner does not extend to any person who continues to receive from other organs or agencies of the United Nations protection or assistance. That phrase, which is in the statute of the High Commissioner, is an oblique reference to UNWRA. because the competence of the High Commissioner for Refugees does not extend to those registered with UNWRA, the UNHCR has managed to avoid the politicization to which UNWRA has fallen prey. A second value of the UN, I would point out, is that there are within the UN itself islands of promotion for respect of human rights which go against the authoritarian grain. One example, again going back to the example of Israel, is the work of former Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shahid. In his 2019 report to the UN Human Rights Council, the rapporteur wrote that he considered the UNWRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm quoting now, when used as a non-legal tool that relies on a contextual assessment of when speech can be deemed anti-Semitic, the definition would serve a valuable function by communicating to public officials and the public at large widely shared concerns about explicit and implicit forms that contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism can take. In May 2022, the rapport set out an action plan to combat anti-Semitism that relied heavily on the UNWRA working definition of anti-Semitism. A third value of the UN is that the global expansion of authoritarian rule is not fixed in stone. It receded, as we saw, and as I mentioned, in 1991 when the UN General Assembly repealed the 1974 resolution that Zionism is racism. It could well recede again. When it does recede, if it does recede, democratic states have to be there and ready to take advantage of the situation. The French philosopher Francois de la Rochefoucauld said the absent are always wrong. A fourth value of the UN is it allows participating democratic states to prevent the bad from getting worse. We cannot assume that without democratic states, the UN will remain as bad as it is now. On the contrary, it's likely to get worse, indeed much worse. Making the UN not as bad as it otherwise would have been may not seem like much of an accomplishment, but it is better than the alternative. At the UN, democratic states need to stand unequivocally for human rights. Otherwise, the distortions which come out of the UN will have a sheen of respectability they do not deserve. However, if that vocal and unequivocal democratic stand for human rights occurs, the harm from majority authoritarian rule at the UN is tempered. A fifth value of the UN today is this. We have to remember that the UN is sitting inside a bubble. What happens within the UN has an audience outside the UN far greater than those involved with the UN. Those outside are perpetrators, victims, and the general public. Perpetrators may have their way within the confines of the UN, but they cannot control the message outside the UN. Outside the UN, the primary audience should be, I suggest, the victims. For them, bringing truth to power, reflecting their victimization within the UN confines is a remedy for their victimization. Disengaging from the UN would mean losing that opportunity to tell perpetrators to their faces in a multilateral setting the harms they have inflicted. Those violators will not like what they hear, but the victims surely will. As for the public, they are going to be far better at judging the rights and wrongs of authoritarian rule if the rulers are confronted, if the violators are confronted directly with their misdeeds within the UN. Those confrontations may not carry the votes, but for the public, what is said may end up being more important than the final vote count. So all in all, the global expansion of authoritarian rule is both harming the UN, making the UN itself an instrument of harm. The response to this harm, though, has to be not disengagement from the UN, but a vocal call to arms, clear, consistent, and bold about what is wrong with authoritarian rule and what is wrong with the UN in ceding to that rule.